Welcome back to Close Up. The Republican challenger in CD2 is once again Steve Negron. We've got a bit of a sequel going here in this district. Thanks for joining us this morning, Steve.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you for having me.
First off, what are your thoughts about the President and First Lady testing positive for coronavirus?
Well, first of all, my heartfelt sympathies go out to them for contracting the coronavirus. But, you know, Adam, he's the President of the United States. He's supposed to be out there meeting the American people. Unlike, Vice President Biden, who was hanging out in the basement. So I think he's going to get through this along with the First Lady. So we're looking forward to a speedy recovery.
What's the appropriate reaction on the campaign trail here? Obviously, Republicans have taken a bit more of a liberal approach to meeting and gathering amid this pandemic. Is this a moment to pause and reflect and maybe think about restricting behavior a little bit more?
Well, you know, as I've said all along on the campaign trail, you know, we understand that there's a population of folks that we need to protect. And I think that's something we should continue to do. It isn't about, in my opinion, Adam, peddling fear. I think that's a lot of things that Congresswoman Custer wants us to do is stay at home and not go out and not meet people. I'm not of that ilk, to be honest with you. We understand that we have a responsibility to those people that are of that universe that are susceptible, and we need to protect them. But, you know, we should try to get back to the way of life the way it was the pre-COVID pandemic.
If President Trump is feeling good around Columbus Day, say, and wants to break quarantine and come to New Hampshire and hold a rally, would you attend?
Well, I think the president will absolutely do what's right and in the best interest of the American people. I believe that if he has a situation where his doctors are telling him to quarantine, that would happen. Absolutely. If he's within those or outside of the 14 days, I would go. But within the 14 days, I don't think the president's going to leave the White House.
Let's get to the race in the 2nd District. People like to think of the 2nd CD as an increasingly safe Democratic seat, but that latest UNH poll shows you within striking distance. So what's your assessment?
Well, I think that's clear. And I think the situation with this latest poll that came out yesterday, Adam, is that people are recognizing that they don't have a representative that actually is the voice of the great state of New Hampshire and even further in the 2nd Congressional District. They're tired of the 8 years of the pettiness. They're tired of the 8 years of the infighting. They're tired of the 8 years of not trying to work across the aisle. Now, look, we all know that it's it's about hyper-partisanship. We now know for 8 years, she hasn't really been the voice of New Hampshire, and this poll is just a testament to that. And so we're excited. This is something that we've been feeling all along, but it's the folks of the 2nd Congressional District that on November 3rd are going to make their feelings and their voices heard. You talk about partisan fights. Obviously, right now, the balance of power on the Supreme Court is a major focus in Washington. Are you hopeful that if and when Amy Coney Barrett is installed on the Supreme Court, that she will constitute a new pro-life majority on that body and overturn Roe v. Wade? Well, the issue for me, Adam, is to have a nominee like the current Supreme Court nominee isn't about overturning anything. It's actually about being able to look at the Constitution and apply the Constitution to this land. You know, people want to make this an issue about one ruling versus another. Anytime I look at a Supreme Court nominee, it's about do they actually interpret the Constitution the way it was intended? And I think Judge Coney Barrett is going to do exactly that.
So let's say that Roe v. Wade does get overturned. Should states be passing laws making abortion illegal?
Well, that would be up to the states themselves. You know, I think that there's been a movement right now that people understand that life is a gift. It is a miracle. And I believe that people are now resonating with that. But at the end of the day, Adam, states need to do what they need to do. The Supreme Court is going to look at how it applies the law against the Constitution, and I think that's what we should be looking for.
How about in Washington? Obviously, Democrats have said that they intend to try to codify abortion rights. What would you be doing if you're the congressman and that issue comes up?
Well, certainly I would have to look at whatever legislation is put in front of us. You know, one of the things that we have to absolutely guard against is having legislation coming from the highest bench in the land. The Supreme Court was never intended to be a legislative body. I think a lot of the folks on the left look at the Supreme Court as being able to do legislative issues. That's not where I come from. The legislative issues come from the Congress and the Senate. And so we would look at, where Congresswoman Custer has always been, and she's always tried to be somebody that supports legislation from the Supreme Court, and that's something that I wouldn't do.
But if it was happening in Congress, where would you stand? Say if Democrats, because they've said they want to pass a law essentially codifying abortion rights.
Right. Well, certainly, my position. I am a pro-life candidate, and so I would look at the bill in its totality. on how it is. And, when quite frankly, we're feeling this big resonance within the 2nd Congressional District that life is precious. And I think that's something I'd have to look at and vote the way the constituents would want me to.
What about the Affordable Care Act? Obviously, Republicans have been looking to repeal that. If that's not an option and the court takes action there, what's the backup plan? Obviously, there'll be a lot of change coming. What would you advocate for as sort of in a post-ACA world?
Sure. Well, the first thing is that we have to have a healthcare system that's affordable and accessible to everybody. The number one thing is that we have to get the government out of providing healthcare. We've seen their attempt at this, and it's, in my opinion, it's failed miserably. So my opinion about healthcare, Adam, is that we have to bring costs down. We have to look at bringing innovation into healthcare. We have to lower prescription drug prices. And I think those things go across partisan lines. Those are things that would absolutely help everybody across this country, and specifically the great folks of the 2nd Congressional.
There was a lot of talk coming out of that last debate about the President Trump's call to the Proud Boys to stand back and stand by. Of course, he also said sure when he would denounce white supremacism, and he also later very clearly denounced the Proud Boys. But as a person of color, does it bother you that President Trump creates these situations where he does denounce them, but then says these other things like stand by that are hard to interpret?
Look, anytime somebody says something, it's going to be interpreted the way they feel that it was meant to be said. Look, as you said, as a person of color, I denounce any way, shape, or form, any sort of entity or agency or organization that would look at somebody in a demeaning way because of their race or their color, their creed, or their gender. That's not who I am. People know me, that I am somebody that is inclusive. I believe that everybody in the Constitution provides protections for everybody. That's exactly what we need to do. And look, it's happened to me. I don't become a victim, Adam. I get better and stronger for it. And I think that people know that when they cast a ballot for me on November 3rd, that I'm going to be somebody that stands up for everybody.
Obviously, this could be a very close presidential election coming up in November. If President Trump loses some key states and refuses to concede, would you support an effort by Republican-controlled legislatures in states like Pennsylvania to award the presidential electors to President Trump, even if it's a toss-up or potentially if he's losing at some point?
Sure. Well, having served in the Election Law Committee in the State House, I completely understand the process by which we elect our president. At the end of the day, it's the people that go out and cast their vote. I believe in a fair election, and when those elections are tallied at the end of the day, and we find out that those were done in the proper and in accordance with the laws of each state, then I would abide by those as we go forward.
Are you worried, though, about voter fraud in this election?
Well, look, I think there's always been situations where we see people that cast a ballot when they shouldn't have. I believe that there are situations that allow itself to happen. But I believe that for my case, in the great state of New Hampshire, in the 2nd Congressional District, we are about a fair election. I think that that's something that right now, I think Ann Custer is worried about it, to be honest with you. I think that she's seeing the writing on the wall, that the folks are looking for a change and they're looking to cast their vote on November 3rd.
How do you seal the deal here in these final weeks? Obviously, in 2018, there was a surge. In 2016, we saw a surge of Trump votes coming in for the 2nd Congressional District nominee. How do you make this work and pull off what would essentially be an upset?
Sure. Well, the number one thing is that I'm talking to the voters of the 2nd Congressional District, and I'm talking to everybody. I'm talking to Democrats, Independents, and Republicans alike. Because hopefully when I'm elected, I go to Washington to represent everyone. It's not me being partisan at all. People have seen me, heard me, and they understand that I want to be a voice for everybody in Washington. As I've said before, I want to bring the clear, crisp water of New Hampshire to Washington and not the Washington water back to New Hampshire.
That Potomac is pretty dirty, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
All right, Steve Negron, thank you so much for joining us on Close Up.
Adam, it's been a pleasure. Thank you, sir.